Right, I understand there's been a few transport problems at Oxford Circus, so we're just waiting a few minutes for people to get here and settle. My name is Rebecca Gray. I'm the Director of Communications and Information at the King's Fund, and welcome to the King's Fund for those of you physically in the room, and welcome to this event for those who are joining online. This is a Wonkcomms event, which you should all know. Wonkcomms was an organisation set up, I think, 2 years ago. I'm looking to my left, by Leonora Merry, Richard Darlington, and Nick Scott. And its purpose is to look at the future of think tank and research communications and the part they play in public policy and the kind of wider policy world. It has turned into what I think is an incredibly vibrant and very generous community, visible not only through events like this, but also through its very strong digital presence. So those who aren't engaged in some way in it already, then please do join on Twitter and LinkedIn and all the other ways of taking part. So the purpose of this event is to look at evidence on the election. It's 197 days until 7th of May. As I think most of us recognise, the debate's certainly already kind of heating up. We're well into argy-bargy already, I think, on certainly in health policy, and I'm sure in all the other areas of public policy that some of you will be interested in. And it's that period where even the politicians that we think of as the most reasonable and rational and recognising of nuance and complexity begin to use evidence and data and research in ways which can frankly be described as shocking. In their best, maybe could be represented as a simplification of an issue for the intents of explaining to the public, and in the worst cases, a straightforward manipulation of the facts. And so therefore, in my view anyway, there's never been a more important time in this period for organisations like think tanks, research institutes and others to keep the debate as honest as possible, to play in the evidence and some objective analysis. So the questions that the panel have been tasked with trying to address tonight are all around the role of evidence in elections, the pitfalls for both politicians and also for those who are trying to inform the debate. So our speakers are from the worlds of science, journalism and public policy research. All experts in health in some way, and science. We are using health tonight as a case study, but I'm absolutely convinced that the insights presented here will absolutely resonate with those of you who have got other policy interests. We've asked each of you to speak for 10 minutes. We'll be fairly tough on that, so we've got some space for discussion at the end. So to my right, Mark Henderson, Head of Communications at the Wellcome Trust, and for that, at the Times for I think for 15 years. Something like that. 15 years. Yeah. And most of that time as a science correspondent and the science editor. A range of awards, too many for me to mention, and has written 2 books, including the Geeks Manifesto, I think the most recent one. Branwen Jeffries, I'm sure will be known to most of you. 25 years at the BBC, is that right? Yes. Absolutely recognised by everyone involved in health as an expert in her field, both in the system, the economics and the policy of healthcare, and very used to getting involved in the health debate and elections, including chairing hustings for the BBC. And Nigel Edwards, I'm just going to call him the national treasure just to annoy him, because that's what Roy Lilly calls him if you follow his column. And I'm not sure if that's just to wind you up or
calls other people worse.
Nigel is Chief Executive at the Nuffield Trust, following a period at KPMG and here at the King's Fund. 11 years before that as Director of Policy at the NHS Confederation, and absolutely one of the most well-known and well-respected figures in health policy. So a great panel, and I think it'll be a great event. So I'm going to kick off with Mark.
Super, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I'm Mark Henderson. You've had my introduction, but I think I'm here really with two hats. There's the hat as the author of the Geek Manifesto, book that's really about evidence in policy making and about what politics can learn from the scientific method. And I think I'll talk a bit about some of a key theme from that to start with, and then maybe move on to some of the things that the Wellcome Trust in my more recent job is doing to promote evidence at the heart of the debate, and then try to just raise a couple of quick pitfalls and problems that emerge as well. The bit of the Geek Manifesto message I really wanted to concentrate on was actually some of the ways, the many ways in which evidence gets abused by politicians and policymakers, especially at election time, but not exclusively. And I mean, everybody knows that, and everybody in this room will know that when politicians say that they like making evidence-based policy, what they really mean is that they like policy-based evidence. Evidence tells them to do what they wanted to do in the first place all along. And indeed, there are so many kinds of this that in the book I drew up something of a taxonomy of it, which I thought I'd sort of share with you to begin with. So you've got evidence shopping is the first form of evidence abuse. It's the most basic kind. It's a cherry picking. It's what Jackie Smith did when she was Home Secretary over drugs policy, where she decided that for political reasons, largely to appease the Daily Mail, that cannabis was to be reclassified as a Class B drug. Never mind the fact that a lot of evidence had already been considered in the round by the Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs. She went out and cherry-picked out the couple of individual isolated studies that supported her case, used those as the basis for a policy that was not evidence-based. There's imaginary evidence. This is also a very common kind. The kind of evidence that's essentially invented to, again, support a policy decision or a personal political position that was arrived at for other means. Jeremy Hunt saying that he supported a 12-week limit for abortion because that's where the evidence pointed. There is no scientific evidence that points to a limit there. There are potentially there are ethical and moral issues and religious issues that perhaps motivated that. But if you were to make an evidence-based look at abortion, that is not where you would draw the line. I don't personally think it's actually an evidence-based issue, but that's a different matter. There's fixing the evidence. You don't like the evidence you're getting, so you change the people you're getting the evidence from. George Bush was extremely good at this, over stem cells, climate change, etc. Over here, there was Alan Johnson and the sacking of David Nutt. My favourite type of evidence abuse is what I call clairvoyant evidence. And this is best summed up by an advisor to Patricia Hewitt. I hope that this person isn't actually here, who told The Independent a while back that home births are safe and we will commission evidence to show that they are safe. You get an awful lot of that. There's also mishandled evidence, which is very good evidence for one thing that's used to justify something completely different. You've seen that, for example, with the badger cull, where evidence from trials that were done in a certain way were then used to justify the rollout of a policy that was different. And then there's secret evidence, evidence you just can't challenge, you can't look at because it's secret, it hasn't been published, you can't do anything with it. And I think what's important about all these kinds of abuse is that it's important to remember evidence is only one of the factors that should go into sound policy making. It's perfectly okay to say, I have a manifesto commitment for X, or I have an ideological preference for Y. But you shouldn't claim that a decision like that is evidence-based when it isn't. And I think that's where things tend to go wrong. And that's where I think the public policy community in the widest sense can do a lot more than it has done in the past to challenge, to call out, to create more of a political cost to this sort of evidence abuse. Now, I'll come back to some of the difficulties with that in a moment, but just to run through a few things that we've been involved in supporting at the Wellcome Trust that go that way. For those of you who don't know us, we're the second largest charitable foundation in the world by spending. We spend 700 million a year, principally on advancing health, principally through biomedical science, but also through public engagement. And communicating, interface with policy, etc., is an important part of what we do. A few of the things we've been doing, we've been actively supporting Sense About Science, who are a great group on exactly this issue of evidence, over their Ask for Evidence campaign, their Evidence Matters website. on the evidence-based claims that they make, to go out there and say, what is the actual evidence for that? And I think the more people get asked that, the more politicians get asked that, the better things should get. There's the Education Media Centre. You may be familiar with the Science Media Centre. The Education Media Centre has started up more recently, which is aiming to connect the very best in education policy making and evidence with journalists. Again, we support that. There's the Alliance for Useful Evidence. Jonathan Bracken, who runs that, is in the room. And we're not directly involved with that, but they are, together with The Conversation, who we do fund, running some manifesto evidence check things. Jonathan, I'm sure, will be able to say more about that when we get into Q&As. And then, really interestingly, we've recently funded several £1 million on an education and neuroscience initiative. There's a hell of a lot of guff gets talked about neuroscience and its implications for education. We've actually funded 6 real proper studies that are going to look at this in an RCT-based way that should actually yield some really significant evidence that could ultimately be used to take some insights from science and apply that properly to policy. Just quickly, if I've got a minute, I'll just run through a couple of challenges that I think are important thinking about this. And the first one that's really critical here is that actually we don't use even ourselves evidence as much as we should in our voting patterns, in our political behaviour. It would be interesting just to have almost a straw poll of people in this room. How many people think that their voting decision at the next general election could still be swayed by a piece of really robust policy-based evidence that were to emerge between now and the general election? 1, 2, 3. It's not very many. And if people who go to Wonkcomms don't think like that, how does it go outside this room? It really does kind of underline, even in our own behaviour, evidence is only one of the very, very many factors that we use to decide how we vote. Now, I argue in the book, and I think it's quite an important argument, that we should get better at changing that behaviour from time to time, especially where there is a particular candidate who maybe is outside our normal voting intention, who is especially good or indeed especially bad. But I do appreciate that's not going to happen a lot. So I think we do need to be prepared to break that. But ultimately, a lot of this is only going to come through challenge. Politicians are only, as a rule, going to feel that they have to treat evidence in the right way if they feel that there is a political cost for not doing it that way. We don't, as the wonk community, the geek community, the science community, people who do care about evidence all the time, we don't do enough to keep politicians honest in that way. Very final point, I think one thing that we don't yet know what the consequences of it will be in this particular election campaign is the Lobbying Act. I can't even remember its full name, but many of us are charities, many of us will be affected by that in what we can and can't say. I'm not an expert on that. All I want to do is to just raise it as something that we all have to be aware of as we pursue this. I'll stop there and hand over to Rebecca.
So I think a lot of what Mark has raised is sort of a good starting point. So journalists sit in between really where the data is and the evidence is, but also where the political conversation is. Now, obviously, the BBC's got a very particular duty to impartiality, to fairness. It's a legal obligation for us as an organisation, and particularly at times that are of high political interest, like elections. And so we have a slightly different role from many of the newspapers in the sense that probably the first thing we have to do is actually just to simply report as accurately and straightforwardly what the politicians are saying they want to do, as well as then going on to provide as much context and analysis as we can. So I think there are 2 things that we need to do. One is to weigh up sort of and signpost for our audiences the data, how accurate are the figures that the politicians are using, what context can we provide to them, and where do you move into the territory of opinion or having a point of view about a particular subject. So the way that we tend to work, I work as part of a team of health and science specialists. One of the things BBC invests in very heavily is specialist journalism on the grounds that we hold a knowledge base to help advise the rest of the organisation. So people come to us to ask us for a bit of context, or where can I find the information to check this, or how can I put this in context, and we try and do that as much as we can. We do that by going back to the source of information. One of the things that concerns us is when a slice of data is taken very selectively. So if someone gives us a set of figures, the first question might be, why have they chosen this particular time frame? What was happening before that? What's the much bigger picture in terms of a very long-term trend, whether that's the number of people turning up to A&E departments, or the amount that the British public is drinking, and how that should be managed. The A&E data is an interesting example which we've had gone to and fro in various stories around. We go back to the Health and Social Care Information Centre. The A&E data set is a relatively new one for them. So there's an issue around data capture. So some figures in an absolute terms appear to go up, but over the period of time, if you look, so is the data capture. And as more hospitals have got better at gathering the information, they may be gathering particular categories. We look at how information is categorized. Can you really tell from this, for example, whether or not someone was really being admitted solely for that reason, for example, an alcohol-related admission, rather than they might have been categorized under a number of different factors. So we try and interrogate the data as much as we can by going back and looking at the source material, and also what's happening in the bigger picture. Sometimes it's also about how we present the figures. There, is bound to be a lot of discussion around health and immigration at this election. I think that's probably quite inevitable. So how do we estimate, for example, the cost of people coming to this country and using health services, and determine who the different people are? The reality is that that's somewhere where there's a bit of a data black hole, so some of the figures that get used are estimates. Now, that then becomes a real part of the debate, but we have to signal to our audience very clearly when something is actually data that's gathered, and when it's something that is a best available guess. And then on top of that, I think you can't separate opinion out of our coverage. We have to host the debate with a wide variety of opinions, and that isn't always well informed, but it is an important part of the political debate. That is part of democracy, is that people will have very strong views about things. They have strong views about their health services, whether as users or as organisations, and that's something that we should be reflecting in our coverage, as long as that's very carefully signalled. And I think that that brings me on to something else I wanted to talk about, which is the political debate that happens amongst think tanks, policymakers, charities, organisations that are very engaged, and where the public might be on a variety of debates. So you could look at local hospitals and how their future should be determined as part of that. There's been a long-running argument and consensus in some ways amongst the health policy world about whether or not it would be better for patients to have services delivered closer to home, and what the implications are for local hospitals. The evidence base around some of that, again, is very patchy. Do we actually know how much it would cost to deliver more care close to people's homes, whether through their GP surgeries or polyclinics, or whatever people want to call them? I think part of our job is to flag up where there are big holes in evidence. It's interesting that Mark mentioned home births. That's the kind of thing on which people have very strong and sometimes polarised opinions, quite often polarised between midwives and doctors in the past. And of course that has been answered by a very, very good bit of research, the Birthplace study, which gave us perhaps the best evidence in the world for the relative safety of different places for people to have their babies. And I think maternity services, as today's news shows, are going to be flagged up as an important part of the future debate for the NHS. Just a couple of other things. I'd like to tell you about two colleagues of mine, and really encourage you to follow them on Twitter. They'll be very interested to engage with all of you around sort of evidence and numbers and debate. First of all, Anthony Rubin, who comes from an economics background. On Twitter, you'll find him as @Anthony_Rubin. he has been tasked with supporting journalists across national news in interrogating and looking at figures. So someone who, in this very busy 24 news cycle where people might have one deadline after another, can actually step out of some of the maelstrom of that and actually work on figures for a few hours. And we have also borrowed from the ONS a statistician who will be working alongside Anthony, who is called Jamie Jenkins, and you'll find him on Twitter as @StatsJamie. So he will again be able to go back to sources of data and speak to people directly for us and help us sometimes untangle what happens, which is that during elections we get something dropped in us, often very late at night, and we're then trying to catch up to interrogate the information as quickly as we can, to be as accurate as we can in a very short time frame. One of my more favourite moments, to be liaised very closely with colleagues at Millbank, was when I got a phone call from the late night political correspondent on duty, who'd been called by the special advisor, who said, "Oh, you don't want to be interested in that other health story." So he rang me to find out what the other health story was. He was being spun something for the next day. So we will work as closely as we can as specialists with our colleagues at Westminster to try and make sure that we're providing a sort of joined up service for our audience. And I think just one other thing, that last thought, which is obviously Twitter and other digital media are probably going to be quite important in this debate and good places for the evidence to be debated. But there is also really a feeling this is an election that is going to be fought in some constituencies very, very much on the doorstep, very much with grassroots political activism and people getting out there. And we've seen that in the recent by-elections. And I don't quite know how you get evidence to the doorstep, but at least we can provide people with context so that when someone does come and knock on their door, hopefully they'll be able to challenge them if they want to.
Yeah, so I was asked to talk particularly about why is health a particular issue in this respect. I mean, the first thing, I don't know, those of you who work in health will know that everyone's an expert, that everyone has an opinion, and that lack of knowledge is no barrier to having one, which is a fact. I don't know if that applies in other sectors, but it certainly seems to be one that affects health. The second and rather unusual thing about health, which economists are very interested in, why is health different from other sectors of the economy? And we tend to talk about things like information asymmetry and third-party payers and all of those sorts of things. But actually, the real reason is that health is one of the few things which causes huge amounts of existential anxiety in the people who consume it and produce it. It's quite different, and there's a whole series of areas of health that people really don't like to talk about. So there's a bit of a tendency to avoid some of the more difficult questions and focus on things which are easy. So if people like to talk about how nice doctors and nurses are and how bad managers are, for example, because it's quite hard to criticise doctors unless they happen to be rich GPs, which has been a sort of a feature of the last few years. The other really notable thing about health is that how much the views of policymakers and to some extent journalists and other commentators, their conception rests on a lot of personal anecdote and experience. So if you look at a lot of the policies about general practice, you come to the conclusion that general practice policy is made by middle-aged men who commute. Oh, it is. It is. There you go. Yes, they can't get to see their GP, so they assume that that's a big problem. Actually, if you ask the public, most users of general practice are below school age, at school or retired. So the sort of concerns that you hear from politicians. So 48 hours, Andy Burnham's policy, 48 hours is neither using man nor beast. You either need to see the GP today, or you might be quite happy to wait for 2 weeks. So it's a sort of figure plucked from the air. By the way, while we're on that, I've noticed a bit of a tendency for magic numbers to appear in political policies. There seems to be fewer of them recently, but I was always thought John Reed always used to divide things by 3. You know, that was his sort of. Why have we got an 18-week target? Does anyone know why we have an 18-week target for waiting? Because we used to have an 18-month target, and there's a sort of nice symmetry in the narrative. You think why were the 27 area teams when in the last reorganisation? Well, because there had been 28 real strategic health authorities in the previous one, and you couldn't be seen to be creating 28 of the same sorts of things as it would look like. I have a rule on that, which you're not allowed to create any number of organisations that's previously existed in healthcare, but it's going to be broken soon because we're actually running out of numbers for reorganisation. The problem with this experience-based policy making is they're atypical, so that's an issue. But the other problem with it is healthcare is massively more complex than the sorts of things they tend to talk about. So they talk about A&E and they talk about elective surgery, and in fact, you would be forgiven for thinking until very recently elective surgery, planned surgery, and A&E were the entire mental model used by politicians to talk about healthcare. They have now, thanks to people banging on about it for quite a long time, finally worked out that chronic disease and ageing is a problem. But it's taken them, and that requires a very different model of healthcare from what we had before. So they've got the wrong model. The other problem they have is healthcare is hugely complex. And how it works, particularly how patients flow through systems and why you get waiting and why you get queues, are due to the complex properties of dynamic systems, not due to capacity. And this is common sense, which says, oh, I've got a waiting list, so I need more doctors or I need more beds. It's just the wrong answer. That's almost certainly not the right answer. If you want to increase your waiting list, a very good way of doing that is to add doctors into your system. Because waiting lists are a property of having doctors, they're a property of the flow in the system. This is a complex idea. I need some calculus to actually explain this to you. So let's ignore all that complexity and just come up with a simple 8,000 more doctors, 20,000 more this. That's a real problem, is the complexities and qualifications that make the arguments work and the policies likely to succeed are stripped out in the way that they tend to be presented. I'm not even sure that when the politicians are doing this, they're aware of how much that has happened to the idea that started probably as a good idea suggested by the type of people who are in this room. So here's a lesson for you: be careful what you wish for when influencing policy. Right? That's a really interesting. The other feature of healthcare, which perhaps relates to everyone's expert, is it does seem to be particularly prone to well-known facts that are not true. Right. A particular one is vast amounts of management is sucking up the resource. UKIP actually are on record as saying there are more managers than nurses. This is wrong by a factor, well, we can debate it, of at least 8, if not 10. The NHS is a bit vague on exactly what a manager is. They don't count them terribly well, which doesn't help. Migrants are using all our healthcare. Jeremy Hunt's estimate of 2.5 billion cost of safety, if you look at the research on which that is based, it is the ropiest thing I have ever seen. It is really embarrassing, but it's now a well-known fact because it will be repeated. So there's a lot of that. A few other little tips. I was asked to give some tips. My disease area costs the NHS 24 billion. No, it doesn't. We don't believe you, and we think you've costed it by counting every single possible thing. And if we added all the disease groups' claims about how much their disease area costs the NHS, it would be equivalent to the GDP of Denmark. You know, we don't believe you. Don't try it. We need a target set for our area. Yes, so does everybody else. If everybody has a target, nothing will happen. That's we've experienced. 1 target's quite effective. 2 targets work quite well. 4 is okay. By the time I get to 10, I'm just going to do my best and hope we hit some of them. So that's another tip. I do think sort of metaphor and things and narrative and personal stories, unfortunately, almost always trump clever, statistically based, research-based evidence. There is something very powerful about the individual stories. Why we have a cancer drugs fund, which is buying marginally, if possibly not effective at all, medicines, and we're not spending it on hypertension reduction or a whole hip replacement or a whole range of actually really very evidence-based things because the anonymous mass have no narrative. But here's a picture of the patient, here's their grieving family, here's a picture of the cat, and these are tragic stories and they're very powerful. Please stop using them. They're an enemy of rationality, but they are engaging. I was going to talk about policy-based evidence, but you heard it. I mean, that is absolutely the bane of our life at the moment. The other one is Palmerston was criticised British foreign policy in the 19th century by saying it was conducted by people whose maps were on too small a scale. So they thought Constantinople was quite close to Russia, whereas actually, and the thing that happens here is politicians imagine things that are important, that look important to them in terms of the political calculus, and actually don't really understand that there are bigger concerns in the rest of the system. So there's a sort of, in the sort of frenetic Westminster liturgy and the sort of policy world we're in, issues assume more importance than they really do if you had a map that was drawn on the proper scale. So we tend to focus on the immediate problem rather than the longer term change. So there's a third problem, which relates to short time scales and a lack of patience and a lack of understanding that any change or improvement generally has a J-curve effect. In other words, things get worse before they get better. And they may get worse before you've even managed to before you've lost patience and you decide to move on. Healthcare policy is particularly prone to the unintended consequence. So you have a small group of civil servants designing a policy to change GP behaviour or to change hospital consultant behaviour. There are 4 of these people in some benighted bit in office in a basement in Leeds. And they're trying to design a policy to outwit 42,000 postgraduate trained people with lawyers and accountants. The bureaucrats have got someone else's money that they're playing with. For the other 42,000 people, it's their money. Who's going to win? Richard Dawkins says rabbits run faster than foxes because for the fox it's just lunch. Evolutionary pressure says you will tend to lose, and your great policy idea, by the way, will undoubtedly produce some unintended consequence that you haven't that needs really careful thought. Which is why the other rule of all good ideas like this is no good deed goes unpunished. You won't get credit for it either, which seems to be the other thing. The final thing to say, I think, is a real problem in health and perhaps more generally about what's your theory of change? How, as a policymaker, do you think you get change? The NHS has become very obsessed with micro-financial incentives. So you can just find the right combination of cheese and electrodes. We can make the mice run through the maze in the right order. You can't, it's too complex. But B, you don't know what shape the maze really ought to be, or could be if you really imagined it. And C, the mice are up to something. And this kind of what's really going on is the attempt to continue to try and do micromanagement of the NHS while pushing a commercial wrapper around it. So we've done a very clever thing. We've taken the agility and innovation that comes with state bureaucracy, and we combined it with the low transaction costs that you get with markets. In other words, we've taken the worst of both systems and put them together. We're wondering why it doesn't work totally right. And it also means we're only using financial incentives and targets when there's a much bigger set of tools in the box. So if your dementia rate is low, what you should be doing is having the GPs in the same. We can calculate your dementia rate from the prevalence evidence. You are 50% lower than you ought to be. You need to go and fix that. And by the way, your appraisal is in 6 months' time, so we'll be talking about it then, rather than me bribing you to do what is actually your job. Which is so we're kind of only using a few tools in the box. The final thing is just picking up the experiments in RCT. I think much more experimentation. We don't know the answer to quite a lot of questions about how you should design healthcare delivery systems, change people's behaviour, implement policy. We do need experiments. I would probably quibble with Ben Goldacre here. RCTs are massively expensive and tend to exclude important things that you are actually interested in the design of complex organisational interventions. Big cluster randomised trials are very, very hard to do effectively, and often we cannot wait long enough for the answers. So we need more pragmatic approaches. We can use statistical process control, quality improvement methods. We can use formative qualitative evaluation. We can use the data that's routinely produced off systems. So we need more multiple methods. Don't bet the farm entirely on RCTs.
Thank you. Right, plenty to think about. Who'd like to kick off with questions? And can I encourage those who are online to tweet your questions, and I will be looking over to Leonor in case any questions come in while we're talking. Who'd like to kick off?
Jonathan Bradford from the Alliance for Use of Evidence. My question is about experimentation. We finished on. A lot of evidence is rightly backward-looking or very immediate present. How do we allow MPs, politicians, to have the space to experiment? It's often said that our system, our legislative system, is sort of biased towards setting things in stone, you trail something in the media, do your green and white paper, manifesting commitments. Very hard once you've started with that to change it and experiment, whether it's a randomized controlled trial or any other way of experimenting. Brilliant ideas don't always survive the first contact with reality. So how do we make a system where it's okay to experiment? And a really specific question, there's 3 questions going in an Ipsos Mori poll to MPs about experimentation. If you've got a question I can add to those, please let me know, but it'll be by the end of today.
Okay, so I'll take the thing about experimentation and also just Nigel's final point about RCTs. I mean, I'm a big advocate of RCTs in the right circumstance for the right project. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, Ben Goldacre, if Ben was here, what Ben would say is, and RCTs for the right project, they're not the only tool in the box, but they are a useful one that we don't use enough. And actually, for things like health policy, for things like NHS-wide health policy, of course, it's actually probably too much. But actually, something like education policy, we don't use RCTs nearly enough, where actually the unit is smaller and you potentially have much greater opportunity. I mean, it's an aside, but RCTs aren't even always ethical, and we're dealing with that at the moment at Wellcome Trust with Ebola, where you can't really do an ethical randomised trial when standard of care, which you would randomise against, has a 70% death rate and civil society is broken down. How do you get informed consent in those circumstances? So even people who are kind of quite sort of rabidly evidence-based like me know that there are limits to RCTs. In terms of how we get people to experiment, how we make it safe for politicians to experiment, I think, I mean, this is going to sound silly in some ways, but people have got to try it. People have got to experiment with experimenting even. It's kind of, I actually have a funny feeling that the politician who stands up and says, you know what, we don't know, I don't know, my shadow doesn't know, let's do some kind of study, whether it's an RCT or something like that, to find out. I think that would be popular. I mean, I have no evidence for that, but I think it would be popular. I think the public are probably quite bored with politicians thinking they know it all and thinking that they're always right. And I also rather like Tim Harford's brilliant idea of having an annual prize for the politician who's been most usefully wrong and admitted it. I think that would be absolutely terrific. Somebody should set it up properly.
I remember, I think it may have been Sarah Montague interviewing somebody about the badger cull and the RCT, and the RCT showed no statistically significant difference between the intervention arm and the control arm. And she said, "Isn't this a failure for the government?" And you could actually hear the scientists go, "Oh God!" She said, "No, it means we've discovered something interesting that this didn't work." We didn't seem to affect policy later, as we were saying, but I think there was also something about how the experiments are then interpreted by journalists, but also by the wider system. The big issue we find is declaring victory too soon. And you see this in pharma too. People stopping trials when actually they probably should be continuing them. The other feature that colleagues at Nuffield Trust see also is kind of also the similar sort of problem, which is actually doing too short evaluation, not giving yourself long enough to see if something works. Actually, we've got quite a lot of method to improve, and we've got quite a lot of people getting to understand what a null result in an experiment means. It isn't a failure. It's not just a but that's quite a cultural shift, I think.
First of all, in health systems, we have got an opportunity to make comparisons which in many ways have been missed, which is across the UK. And one of the great difficulties as a journalist is sort of data opacity, or just things being simply measured in a different way, so that we cannot really make a proper comparison between what's going on in Scotland and England, for example, or Scotland and Wales. Although the Nuffield Trust has done some very good work on trying to do that and give us a sense of the four systems. The other thing is things being set up in the heat of an election or promised during the heat of an election, and not necessarily being evaluated as fully as they could have done. So the Cancer Drugs Fund is an interesting example that was promised during the last election. We can measure how many people have had drugs funded as a result of that, but as one cancer specialist pointed out to me recently, we're not evaluating in any way, for example, what other spend is being avoided in the health system. So, for example, if you're managing someone's symptoms better, are you also avoiding them pinging back into hospital? And it just simply wasn't set up in that kind of way. And yet we're probably going to see it sort of roll on for some years onwards. And the other thing I think is that politicians are very aware of their own sort of political mortality. So there's always this tension between wanting to show that they're getting something done within a parliamentary term. We do occasionally see things being piloted. They're called all kinds of inventive different things. Pathfinder is one of the more opaque descriptions I've seen applied to pilot projects. But there has to be really transparent, open reporting and again, good evaluation, because often the timescale in which that happens is you might have 10 sites trying something, and then it's virtually being rolled out before there's been a good analysis or time to reflect on the evidence. And the most useful thing, I think, in terms of trying to make comparisons is some of the work done by people like Muir Gray, mapping variation, where you can look at certain things, and one of our sort of favourite examples is diabetic amputations. You know, that they're largely avoidable. It's clearly not a good thing. It's not arguable that it's a good outcome for the patient, and yet there is variation from one bit of the country to another. It's unacceptable that if you're diabetic in one part of the country, you might be more likely to lose a limb than in another, when it's something that could be prevented by low-cost healthcare.
I think there's a point to pick up from what you said about evaluation, which was really important, which is we don't, in policy making, use the natural experiments well enough either. I mean, David Willits is really, really good on this, and he points out that actually pretty much whenever you introduce a new policy, there are unknowns, and you can't always have the best evidence to hand, and you do need to take, as Nigel said, decisions more quickly than doing an RCT first. But when we do that, we far too seldom set them up in such a way that we actually gather useful evidence and then evaluate it, and also commit to the idea that you might change the policy if the evidence showed it to be wrong. I mean, one of the things that my old colleague Phil Collins at the Times told me this, having worked in Number 10, that there's profound disincentive built into the system to evaluating policies properly, because you don't want to show that your policy didn't work.
Question here on the right.
Hi, I'm Jake Elliott with the National Housing Federation. My question is really around how do we improve the quality of evidence as part of the policy debate? A lot of the suggestions so far have been around getting better evidence, better methods for evaluation. I suppose my question enough, is that the right frame for the question? Or is, even if we had better evidence in the policy community, are there still big responsibilities for us to try and actually tackle a political culture that's not very good at dealing with uncertainty and facing complex systems in public services?
Shirley Ayres, Connected Care Network. Simon Stevens, 5-year forward view, identified £8 billion needed to sustain the health service. What evidence do you think politicians are going to select to justify why they're not going to pay £8 billion in the next 5 years?
I feel like I have to start with Nigel.
Yeah, I'll try tackling that one, because the other question was even harder. Well, actually, one of the clever things about that 5-year forward view, I think, is it closes down a number of the favoured ways out that politicians have got to do precisely that. It basically says, there's even actually a subtext, which is it will be 8 billion if you're lucky. It may well be more, but a number of the sort of the usual stuff. Oh, we'll get it or we'll get it for integration, or it's actually saying, look, you may get some of this through this route, but it's hard, and even if you do that, there is a problem. The other thing it does is it says it says to people who say, oh, we'll give you flat real, that's a con. It's not flat real, because the population's aging and growing. So it redefines the terms of debate by saying it's flat real per risk-adjusted person. So it does close a number of the doors. That doesn't mean that it can't be ignored, or elements of it can't be ignored, but it does make it easier to call people out and say, actually, if you look back at the evidence, it won't do that. One of the things I have noticed, particularly about quite a lot of the politicians who seem to end up in health, is they are really bad listeners. I don't know if you see this in other. You could not get Andrew Lansley to listen to anything, and Andy Burnham shows similar signs of worrying certainty untroubled by evidence. In particular, one is proposals to completely change the way that money moves to the system won't lead to a major reorganisation, which is one of the doors that which I think everybody who works in healthcare says, well, yes, of course it does, because reorganisation is what this is core competence of many NHS managers, is reorganisation, is what they do. It's what they've been doing for the last few years. But getting people to actually acknowledge this stuff is really hard. So he's sort of put that down and said you mustn't reorganise. There's a limit to what you can do on efficiency. Integration will save you something, but don't bet the farm on it just yet. So I think it's quite a clever document in that respect, actually, and it's quite unusual to find an arm's length body or several arm's length bodies of government doing something quite so in your face as that, really. So you should probably be congratulated on it. Whether you'll be listened to, with my previous comments, who can say? How Chatham House is this? I've just realised. Not at all. They can probably ask me to retweet it. I stand by what I said. And if you could just not tweet that bit about Andy Burnham.
I think it would be
Too late. It's all done. Yeah. I'm watching you all. Yeah.
Well, for obvious reasons, I'm not going to get drawn into commenting on the individual parties, but I think that I'd just like to point out one interesting contrast, which before the last election, we had David Nicholson setting out the efficiency savings that he thought the NHS could deliver, what the size of that would be. And all of the major political parties signed up to that. And it had the effect of taking the money question out of the election in many ways. So it didn't become a major issue. And I think for many of the reasons that Nigel's described, that won't be the case this time. It's very hard to argue that Simon Stevens is not in a position to have a bird's eye view of how the finances will look over the next 5 to 6 years. And clearly, whichever way you look at it, there is a gap between what the main parties are offering currently and where he thinks things might be within 5 to 6 years, and that will, I think, shape the debate.
On the question about the quality of evidence, I think it's a really good one, and as Nigel said, it's hard. I don't have all the solutions by any stretch, but the one thing I think would help. It'd be interesting to bring Jonathan in on this, because it's very much what the Alliance for Useful Evidence has been set up to do, I think. But is too often, and actually it's probably less this audience than the academic audience that I talk to more. The kind of evidence they produce is often not desperately well set up for use by Whitehall politics, and the language, the way in which things get framed, is just actually quite difficult to then turn into policy action. And one of the things I think that the academic community and universities particularly don't do well enough is do that knowledge transfer into policy. Every university has a knowledge transfer office to build things with business. That's right. Some aren't any good, but that's a different story. But every university sort of figures out that that's something they really ought to be doing. But hardly any have the same thing for policy. Cambridge has one, which does a very good job actually, and does a lot of kind of exchange programs with Whitehall. And it's sort of almost having the academic and the policy one talking each other's language, which and I think a lot breaks down in quality of evidence over that. It's not the only solution by any means, but
yeah. There's quite a lot of evidence actually on how policymakers use research evidence. It's not, for those of us who do research, it's not hugely encouraging, I have to say. But here's a clue. They're not going to read a 120-page report. Yeah. They're really not. They're going to read, if you're lucky, a short executive summary.
Yeah.
And the executive summary is not 27 pages, which is one particular favourite I remember. That's a report. In fact, that's quite a long report. So, I mean, the attention span of quite a lot of the people that we're aiming at is how many words?
400 characters.
400? Any higher? Higher, lower, higher, lower?
You can probably get to 1,000.
You can probably get to 1,000, yeah.
So
They may have people working for them who will read 2,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. But even then, you know, you're stretching it. So I think there's a real. The other point is that if it doesn't hit them at the point they need it, they don't necessarily have the knowledge management systems to pull it back. So you probably need to send it to them again at the point at which that window opens. Which there's an opportunity to use this idea. The slight hazard with this is that you then get this problem of people who've got solutions looking for problems. Which has been a bit of a feature of health policy over the last few years, which is, you've got a problem, I've got a solution. It may not necessarily be the solution to your problem, but I'd like to see this policy implemented. The sort of policy entrepreneur, mutuals, there's a particular example. Yeah, that's a solution looking for a problem.
It's that brilliant Damien McBride blog about the budget process, and I'm sure lots of you have read that, about how in George Osborne's Omnishambles budget, there are all kinds of things that he noticed that various officials have been trying to push for years and that had got through.
Can I go, terribly rude, green coat, and then there's here, and then.
Thanks. My name is William Birds from the UK Energy Research Centre, not medical. But my question, well, I sort of had two parts to the question. One part was, in what ways do you think this election is different? And you've already alluded to something from the previous election, for that matter, the 1979 election or the 1945 election, in terms of the way evidence might be processed or used. And secondly, when we come to the point after this election, what's a win for evidence going to look like? How do we know that we sort of won that battle, at least? Or won the war? How do we know that?
Yeah, and then.
A few years ago, after the riots, I was asked to do a trial with some self-referred mental health patients at Anne's Hospital in North London. And I just want to ask you a question about evidence that relates to what came out of that. One of the things that we learned about mental health was that not everything is something you can get evidence for. There are instances where actually people's experience is actually useful. And there are other instances where we haven't got any experience, we haven't got any evidence, but we do have a good model to understand things. And what came out of that was the realization that it's not evidence that's important per se, but what's important is proof. And there are those three proofs. There's actually evidence, it's a form of proof. People's experience is a form of proof. And models that explain things and make sense of things are forms of proof too. When you've got all three of those, then typically you've got a good proof. I just wanted to ask each of you, if you were going to work with those three proofs, which would you put first and why?
It's a quite complex question, so I think I'll hold off on the third one for now to give you a chance to think about that a little
So
bit.
what's different about this election? One thing that's different about this election is there's more parties, and at least one of them doesn't even pretend to be interested in evidence.
Which one?
Each one.
But also, I think that we're going into this knowing that there's a great degree of uncertainty. So everyone knew that the last election was going to be, closely fought, but there was still a degree of surprise that we ended up with a coalition government, because that's not something that's happened in our political system before. Whereas everyone is going into the next election knowing that there are no certainties around, how it might play out. And in terms of a win for evidence, I would only hope that during the election process that anyone comes up with an idea that really isn't very evidence-based, that gets roundly scrutinised in a way that the public can make the decision for themselves.
Do people think there's more people doing the scrutiny? So a shift certainly in the last 5 years has got to be around. People may not be happy with how it's transparent, but there is some more transparency around some more forms of evidence in the NHS anyway, and social media has opened up discussion, debate, and opened up voices into that. Does that mean there's more the kind of, what's it called, the armchair auditor, the equivalent of that?
In one respect, yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think there is a lot more of that. But actually, the serious side of my flippant comment about one party not being interested in evidence at all is that that's actually having an effect on the other parties as well. It's making them less interested in evidence too. And so you do have, I think, you do have more people out there who are kind of interested, holding people to account, asking the question, asking for evidence, trying to create the cost. But then politicians are being tugged in the other direction by a sort of much more visceral sort of argument around how people feel rather than what they think. And that's not good for evidence-based debate at all. And actually, to your question, I think the most powerful form of proof is social proof. It's what people see other people around them doing, and that is always going to have more influence over people than reading what the evidence says on something. And we kind of need to think of ways. I have no idea how we do it, but think of ways how you can join them up.
So can I just come in on that second question? I think wasn't the whole lesson from Stafford is that ignoring what people were actually saying about what was happening and ignoring stuff that was initially perhaps seen by the health system as being anecdotal actually was core to what was going on in that hospital. And I think you see that in some of the scrutiny around the health system around the importance of soft intelligence as well as of hard data. And particularly, as Nigel said, in healthcare, it is something people have intensely personal views of, and what might be acceptable to one person and might not be to another. And the health systems are going to have to move towards sort of meeting people's expectations in terms of their experience of how they're managed as an individual. As well as how the big data might look for the system as a whole.
Can I add to the question from the audience? So, community health is something we've written about and interesting as well. I think it plays into this. So I think it's something that we're looking at the moment at the fund, and it's where the data doesn't exist, but there is a feeling, an experience, there's anecdotal information about people getting less access to services, poorer quality services. And the impact of that won't be measurable in the same way that people suddenly going from a 4-hour wait in A&E to an 8-hour wait. It won't be as visible. There'll be a lag in the impact of either economic or policy decisions that could actually you won't see for 10 years or 15 years, way outside the political cycle. So I suppose it relates. The experience is on the ground. It's often people who no longer access the service, so the data around them is non-existent.
Yeah, and there's an added problem, which is this continuous difference between people who actually experience health services and what people actually think about them who've not used them. And I think that has narrowed slightly, but people have a sort of narrative about healthcare which is different from people who actually experience it. So there's a very high level of subjectivity here, which, and then there's lots of people who are missing in the system. So yeah, what were your other forms of proof? Just remind us.
3 forms of proof are evidence, experience, and education.
Right.
I only ask because
I think the social proof one is the key one. Yeah,
that's a mix of experience and education. That's what we class that. I only ask because last year I won European funding to explore how you can get validity through social proof, and that's what I've just finished doing in conjunction with the World Foundation.
Okay, I'm going to go here then to Leonora.
Right, hi, Jeff Knezovich, soon to be of the Nuffield Trust. I was really interested by Bronwyn's comment very at the beginning that this election will be won on the doorsteps and kind of the challenge that she put to the Wonkcomms audience, because effectively I feel that, I mean, we're Wonkcomms, we're very comfortable talking about evidence to policy, and all of this discussion here has been focusing on how do we get policymakers to use the right sort of evidence. Well, we've had 5 years since the last election to be talking with the policymakers. This is the chance to talk with the general public. So how do we get evidence on the health service in the hands of the general public on the doorstep? What would be your response to Bronwyn's challenge?
Yeah, I just want to tell you something that I picked up from Twitter, and not related to this, but I thought about it, it's related to the topic. Channel 4 News apparently just said that there's going to be a NHS shortfall of £300 billion by 2020. Evidence that numbers are challenged for a lot of people. Obviously, it's going to be trillion. On an
So they said 300 billion.
They said £300 billion for the NHS, 3 times what the NHS costs. So yeah, we all struggle with numbers. The question I was going to ask was about, I think you touched on a little bit what you were saying in terms of the impact of social media. I was wondering whether you think social media in total is a positive or a negative sort of force in terms of getting more evidence to the policy debate. I was really struck when it was the Scottish referendum by there was a chart that went around, I think it was the Ashcroft poll, about the profile of people who voted, and there was a bit about the under 18, no, yeah, it was the 16 to 18 vote based on the sample size of 17. And that was a graph that went round on Twitter like wildfire. And I think, it was a very easy to embed and understand image, but that actually was quite damaging to the quality of the debate. So there's the kind of negative side, but there are obviously many positive. So do people think on balance it's good or bad that we have a lot more engagement on social media?
Oh gosh, yeah.
You love a bit of Twitter.
I love a bit of Twitter. Yeah, no, the things spread quickly, and misinformation spreads very quickly on Twitter. The infographic is an interesting. We've had an interesting experience with an author of a piece of research who, when presented with the data from his own research in an infographic, noticed it was wrong by quite a lot. And this had been proofread by him and his colleagues. He'd done research several times. Fortunately, it was spotted and saved, but there is something very compelling about infographics. It does seem to the example there is it reframed it for him, and he was supposed to be the expert. Proved to be not quite the expert we thought it was, but unfortunately we'd already paid him. It's just a shame. I won't name I'm sent to him. It's the other interesting thing how it seems to polarize, and you get very quickly into some very bad behaviour in a way that you don't when you're having face-to-face conversation. It's a very intriguing medium. The question I don't know the answer to is I've noticed on Twitter, on the whole, that all the people I follow who follow me tend to agree with me. So we're all self-congratulatory, basking in our shared wisdom and insight. Occasionally I get it wrong, for example, by asking the GPs on Twitter why they don't have any real-time data, only a load of anecdotes, which was, I could have posted me hitting a kitten with a stick. It would have had less impact. But on the whole, there is a bit of a danger, I think, that we all float in this world where we all agree with each other, and when you actually do sometimes bump into there's another dark underbelly of this stuff, but they don't tend to follow policy wonks, but occasionally they just stumble across you and decide you suddenly see that there's a whole have a completely different worldview. Fortunately, you can block them, so you don't have to have it, have your. But do you not think sometimes we're floating in this sort of self-congratulatory, warm bath of adulation?
A very good description as well that I heard a while ago was that Twitter is or can be largely the kind of people who are in this room, whereas Facebook is for everyone. And I think it's quite interesting that the way that think tanks and charities can often tend to engage is largely through their websites and through Twitter. And I don't know whether that's the kind of engagement that really gets to people. I don't know how much people actually watch policy content, for example, on YouTube. Somehow, I suspect all the baby videos get nudged down to the way people post quite a lot of sort of content that's not easy for people to digest. And I think that there is a danger because of that, of this sort of political village kind of consensus that actually is quite divorced maybe from how people are having conversations about exactly the same subjects on their sofas on the doorstep, when they're actually making their decisions about their voting intentions.
I think, I think that's true, and certainly what the point about being able to use social media to create your own private world where people who disagree with you don't get in is very true. But that can have elements of strength to it as well, to the anonymous question. And I think that the good thing and what people who care about evidence need to do with this is to build communities around evidence that then become advocates for it corporately. And one of the things I write a lot about in the book that I open up on actually is the whole case study of the Simon Singh libel case, and how a bunch of skeptics, geeks, whatever you want to call them, basically changed libel law. And they did. And if that case hadn't happened, we wouldn't have had libel reform. Simon was very close to chucking in the towel on that case, and would have, I think, have done so had he not got this enormous sense of support on Twitter, especially. But then what happened was that group didn't just stay on Twitter. They moved off Twitter and started to actually create a proper grassroots campaign around this at the same time. And I think it's the ability to meet like-minded people and then to turn into a campaigning force that is something that social media does that people in our line of business can potentially exploit for what we would like to think are good purposes. So there are dangers, but there are opportunities for sure as well.
And actually, the whole armchair auditor aspect, that has become much easier with Twitter. Yeah. For some reason, academics are much more likely to get in touch with me and say, "Have you seen this paper?" and send it to me on Twitter.
Or to say your report was wrong.
Or to say it was wrong, either. But to actually engage very actively and quite quickly in a way that they would never have emailed or picked up the phone before. And I think that's good. It's challenging for journalists, but I think that's really good. And we welcome people sending us bits of evidence if it, adds to or contradicts something that's being said in the public debate.
Next question. Back over there on the right, and then
Ian Blunt from Nuffield Trust. I was thinking about how you say there's no one reads 27 page reports, which of course is true, but a lot of those pages are about demonstrating how robust the piece of work you've done is. So you do a lot of distilling and it becomes a paragraph, an infographic, and a tweet. Then it goes out and it's competing with a lot of other things about the same length that aren't nearly so robust. So how, at that level that people actually take notice of, do you still demonstrate that it's a robust piece of work that should be taken seriously?
That's a great question.
I'm hoping the next person is not from the Nuffield Trust.
No, I'm a freelancer and I work a lot in knowledge transfer. I'm a trade research researcher. I work a lot in constant communication, so I kind of bridge the worlds in a way. That's what I wanted to ask you, but I think you've touched on it in different directions throughout what you've said. But can we sum up a little bit more about the whole process really as a conversation? And in a way, research and policy have to talk to each other more, and we have to be more open to the conversation about perhaps the fact that policy influences evidence sometimes, as well as evidence influencing policy. And there's a whole sort of conversation rather than like fixed impacts at particular times from evidence simply influencing policy perspectives need to come into how evidence is communicated to policy people. It's really important.
I'll take one more because we haven't got very many rounds. I'll take one more. Is there somebody at the back? Very back?
I just wondered about the thoughts about funding and perhaps comparing and trying to get politicians to realise the impact of something, comparing the public's view on something compared to their own. I saw something from the NHS conference speaking about they asked politicians whether they thought changes to the NHS would upset their constituents. A lot of them said yes, in comparison to actually asking the public, who had less of them had said that they thought that would be a bad thing. So I just wondered if panel thoughts on whether polling could produce something that could lead them to real change or something.
But people lie in those kind of polls. They want fundamentally incompatible things. They want more spending and tax cuts at the same time. And
so no value, less value.
Well, also that poll was commissioned by an organisation that spent some time. I used to work for it. I disagree with its current strategy. It spent some time trying to persuade politicians that they should be brave, which means they should put their reputation on the line for kind of managerial changes to the NHS, which they don't want to be bothered to try and persuade the public are a good idea. So I'm suspicious of the provenance of that poll. I'm suspicious that people are telling them that the real options have been put to them. And, you can't blame politicians for being risk averse in those circumstances.
I was going to say on polling, we've got particular guidelines around political polling and how those are used and how we broadcast them. But generally, if it's a standalone one-off poll, we tend to regard that with more scepticism. If it's something that we can see a trend series over time, it's much more interesting. And I still cannot believe the numbers of time that we get self-selecting samples sent to us. So, even from quite reputable organisations, saying that 2,000 people say this, and it's the 2,000 people out of say 40,000 that have chosen to respond. It's not randomised in any way. It's not conducted in any way with the kind of guidelines that all the proper polling organisations stand up to. And we hate a sort of surveys of 1,000 people say this when we don't know how they've been conducted and whether they tell us anything useful at all.
Can I answer the question about how we validate evidence and so on, and especially in the context of the 200-page report going unread, which I think is true. So it is a really interesting question, and to some extent you do need to do the groundwork and have that somewhere, even if you're not going to publish it. I mean, one thing, speaking as a comms person, and I'm sure this will be common to all of you, but why do we need to publish and promote those things and put them on PDFs on the website and all that? Sometimes you do need to do that, but sometimes people want things pushed out to the press, to politicians and policymakers that are just utterly impractical and a waste of resource, frankly. But one of the ways I think you can do that is actually it's your organisation's brand, and investing in really tight quality control for everything you put out of that sort, and having internal checks so that you're not putting out dodgy data. And then if you become known for being an organisation that isn't putting out dodgy data, then your brand will resonate through that. And that's what brand does in a lot of ways. And I think think tanks, charities, etc., can invest more in their brand for that reason as well as for fundraising.
Let's be clear. Just because the policymakers don't read very long reports doesn't mean you don't need them. For a start, they're not the only audience. There are other researchers and people. Secondly, people do need to see you're working. They need to know you've done the work. They do need to know that you've done the work. There's also, you kind of answered a bit of your own question, that process of doing the thinking that gets you to the answer may require that level of. You may need to be able to show that working. You may need to actually have to write a 200-page report to be able to write the really pithy 1,000 words. I absolutely agree on brand. So it is really important that what you put out is good. But there's other ways to deal. I mean, we have this debate internally in Nuffield Trust. So high quality, rigorous research using proper methodology, peer review, published in peer reviewed publications, establishes your brand and credentials with one group of people. Intelligent comment on what's happening in policy in real time establishes it with others. These could be, if done well, I think these can be mutually reinforcing. You don't have to be totally pure research. We only publish anything once, I think, every 3 years when we finish. You can use your accumulated knowledge and experience and wisdom to comment on other things. If you do it judiciously and well, you build the brand. Then when you do publish a piece of very high quality rigorous research, that other people will pay attention to it who don't normally read that stuff.
It's also about learning to say no to things as well, and to say no to opportunities that are off strategy, not wasting your time on doing 200-page reports on things that either don't matter to your organisation or that don't matter to politicians and are never going to matter to politicians if that's your goal.
I think, if someone's producing a big document, we want to know, is it core to their purpose? Is this absolutely what this organisation does? Are they the most authoritative people to speak about it? And we do look at them. We might not read all of it in one go, but we go back to it for reference points. Or if there's something that doesn't ring true, or that is where we want to challenge the evidence, we want to be able to go back to the workings out. But I also think that for you, maybe it's a good discipline to try and do that distillation, because isn't that about, in the end, deciding what you want to say? You know, often one of the things that happens is we'll get a very large sort of chunk of information and evidence. We're saying, well, what are you saying is the significance of this, the meaning of this? And I think part of that distillation process is an intellectual discipline of saying, well, what are we saying is most important out of this, and what do we think should be the main focus of debate about it?
We could do one more round. So, I'm called Sophie Dixon. I used to work in mental health policy, and I work for IPPR. We used to do
Speak up a little bit.
Sorry,
thanks, yeah.
we used to do quite a lot of work on the economics of mental health policy and the impact of mental health, as opposed to. So we used to do lots of stuff on early intervention and the outcomes and the benefits of that economically, which used to get quite a lot of good coverage in terms of the figures. But in my experience in mental health, the figures and the stats that get the most coverage are the negative ones, the sort of what's happening at the moment, so that you're twice as likely to get sectioned if you're black, and half of all kids who get sectioned go to a police cell. That sort of like really negative stat that gets more coverage rather than the quite positive outcomes for the little amount you have to invest in early intervention for the massively good outcomes. That gets very little coverage, and I understand the problems with early intervention and long-term sort of viewpoint. But my question is, do you think that more negative stats that point to a problem get more widely covered than positive stats that can offer a solution?
Yes. Try and take
Yes. I'm Richard Darlington, I also look at IPPR. Maybe there'll be a third person. I wanted to just give an example of soft intelligence that Brandon was talking about, a sort of individual story. And that's a guy called Phil, who I met, who has a son with autism, and he lives in Cornwall, and he was told his son was going to be put into a hospital in Birmingham for just 12 weeks. And 6 months later, he was sent a letter, which was basically said, no, actually, he is going to stay there in Birmingham. And this prompted Phil to start an online petition and start a campaign called Bring Josh Home. And in the first 48 hours, he got about 10,000 signatures on this petition. And he got a phone call from the local chief executive of Cornwall and was told that his case had been noticed. This is after 6 months, remember us. And was asked, for a meeting, and he said, well, when do you want me to come in? He said, no, the chief executive will meet at your convenience. 2 years later, 3 meetings with a government minister, eventually, and 200,000 signatures on this online petition. And Phil wins his case, and Josh is going to come home back from Birmingham, and he's going to be cared for in Cornwall. Soft intelligence. But I spoke to Phil about this, and he said after 6 months, and we got this letter, he just felt completely ignored and that he had no chance and he couldn't be listened to. And for him, the petition was what unlocked it for him. Even though he had a local media coverage, he'd had some attention, but the petition showed that he wasn't going to go away. And then he was listened to. I talked to him about it, and he didn't see it as a policy problem. He didn't see it as a saving money problem. He just felt this is a big bureaucracy. People weren't talking to anyone.
How do I get through?
I was a father and I wasn't listened to, but once I was a father with 100,000 people behind me, then I was listened to. And the reason I sort of cite that one individual example is because there are now 8 petitions of parents with children with autism with almost exactly the same sort of problem on the same change.org online petition site. And it just points to me as a kind of bit of soft intelligence where there's clearly a systemic problem. And why do we need online petition sites for the system to...
But of course, 8 petitions won't have the same impact that the first one has.
The first one had.
Yeah.
Different impact. Consolidation, as Richard said, and soft intelligence.
Can I just share an observation which resonates with that and kind of relates to what I said earlier? In the work that I was doing, especially with people who've got mental health issues, because their mind is not so engaged in what they're doing, their feelings and their hearts tend to be more engaged. And what we found in terms of social proof was it wasn't a gathering of like-minded people that got things changed. It was a gathering of like-hearted people that got things changed. And it was feelings that tended to override people's thoughts and perceptions. And it was an interesting outcome of working with mental health people that people who've got very different opinions in terms of their mindsets, nevertheless, would work together because they were coming from the same place in their heart. And I found that to be quite an interesting observation when we looked at the overall results of the research. You will find social media, especially with CEOs and boardroom members of organisations, they will find social media a threat to bureaucracy. And they will do everything they can to stop it being a threat, including just pacifying the necessary people in order for it to be done. So like-hearted people can make a lot of change in a very butterfly effect kind of way and change the culture, all with a little bit of flapping of wings in the right place.
Can I just take the question about the negative stats and so on? And you, unequivocally, that's right. I mean, Bramwin and I, you go into your editor with something that's kind of negative, scandal, world's falling apart, you've got far better chance. It's just the way of the world. I think what you need to do, there's sort of two things to think about with that. The first thing is always when you're communicating with evidence, it's actually what are you trying to achieve with it, and are you, and what's your strategy for actually for making that difference with it. And if you judge that going negative with that actually isn't going to advance the strategy, it might get you some coverage, but that coverage is not actually going to, at the end of the day, advance your goal, then you shouldn't be doing it. There's an awful lot of media relations activity and comms activity that gets done because it produces output rather than outcome, and it's really tempting to, I can get an easy, quick win and get lots of coverage for my report this way, and yet it doesn't actually advance what that report was trying to achieve. So I think that's the thing you've got to judge with that. I mean, the other thing is that there are often other creative ways other than going negative of getting coverage. I mean, okay, the issue you raised is a particularly hard one because it's really hard to demonstrate that cause and effect in a personal way, which is often one of the ways you can do that. But it's a challenge for sure.
No, Nigel's got to depart. Could you put a last comment to make, Nigel?
No, really. I think I've said enough. That's another lesson.
Enough Can I ask the question? I know that I should just have to go. One last, is it worth it? I want to say, is it worth it? So, you know, the King's Fund's almost got into difficulty in the middle of election campaigns for being asked very straight factual questions, being wrapped up in and accused of having accused ministers of lying and all sorts of things by setting facts often around the economics on the table. It's dangerous territory. Should we just keep away?
No,
absolutely not. It's the right answer.
If groups like the groups that are all represented here aren't going to do it, who is?
Yeah.
And it's running away. Yeah, you've got to do it.
Well, thank you very much for speaking. Really, fantastically kind of energising debate. I had about 15 questions that we didn't get a chance to answer myself. So apologies to those in the room that didn't get an opportunity either. And thank you for Wonkcomms for organising the event. There's lots, I know, on the King's Fund's website around health and the election, also on the, I'm sure on the websites of all the other organisations involved in Wonkcomms, and the Wonkcomms Twitter account probably is a good way of keeping up to speed with new stuff that's going on, so if you don't already follow it, please do. Thanks again to our panel. There is a bar in our Edwards room on the first floor, which is now open. It's not in our usual cafe and bar area, it's on the first floor, and you're very welcome to go up there for a drink.